The plan had been simple, the way all the best plans are before the world gets involved. It was a Friday in December, and the city was doing what Chicago does in December, throwing cold at you like it had a grudge. I'd left work early, which was rare. I ran a small investment advisory practice out of a shared office on Michigan Avenue. Just me and two analysts and a paralegal named Donna, who kept everything from falling apart. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. I'd spent 11 years building something quiet and self-sustaining, the kind of business that doesn't make the news, but makes money reliably. And I liked it that way. Quiet things were easier to protect. Daniel knew I worked hard. What he didn't know, what no one at Arrowfield Capital knew, was the name I worked under before I became Mara Chen. I was born Mara Solis. I kept the name professionally. When Daniel and I married 11 years ago, I hyphenated socially, took his name at the DMV and on our joint checking account, smiled in the photos. But Solis Capital LLC had been registered 3 years before I ever met Daniel, at a rooftop bar on a night that feels like someone else's memory now. That LLC had its own EIN, its own bank accounts, its own signature on a shareholder agreement with a then startup called Arrowfield Capital. I'd invested $400,000 in seed funding in exchange for 34% equity. The company had grown. The equity had grown with it. And Daniel had spent the last 4 years climbing the ladder at Arrowfield without ever knowing his wife owned the building. I want to be clear. I didn't hide it to deceive him. In the beginning, I kept it separate because I'd spent years watching women merge their financial lives into their husbands and lose the thread of who they were. The money I put into Arrowfield came from an inheritance from my grandmother. Her savings, her life's work, her name. And I wanted to honor that by keeping it intact, identifiably mine, untouched by anything that came after. I told myself I'd tell Daniel eventually kept moving further away, the way it does. That Friday, I hadn't been thinking about any of that. I'd been thinking about the black dress in the back of my closet, the one I'd bought in September and never worn, and about surprising my husband at his company's year-end gala. He'd mentioned the party 3 weeks earlier, casually, the way you mention something you don't actually want attended. The Arrowfield gala is the 14th, he'd said, scrolling his phone. It's mostly a work thing. You'd be bored. I'd nodded and let it go. But then, 2 weeks later, he'd said, almost offhandedly, I keep meaning to introduce you to some of the people at work, maybe after the holidays. And something in the way he said, after the holidays, like it was a promise being moved to next semester, and the semester after that, made something small and cold settle in my chest. I wasn't suspicious. Not exactly. I was paying attention. There's a difference. I'd called the venue that morning to confirm the event. The Pinnacle Room at the Meridian Hotel. Rooftop. Cocktail attire. 7 p.m. I'd done my hair. I'd worn the dress. I'd carried the envelope. The envelope contained a single document. A greeting card with a reservation confirmation for a weekend in Sedona. We hadn't taken a vacation in 2 years, and I'd booked it on a whim the week before. Feeling generous. Feeling hopeful. Feeling the way you feel when you decide to stop waiting for a marriage to improve and start doing something about it. I slid it into a card that said, "Surprise," on the front in gold letters, and felt very pleased with myself the whole cab ride over. I arrived at the Meridian at 7:22 p.m. The lobby smelled like pine and money. The elevator to the rooftop was glass, and through it, I could already see the lights of the party. White string lights overhead, round tables with low floral arrangements, a bar along the north wall where the city sprawled out behind it like a backdrop someone had rented for the occasion. There were maybe 200 people. Servers in black moved between them like chess pieces. The champagne flutes caught the overhead lights and threw tiny prisms on the ceiling. I stepped out of the elevator and immediately heard someone I didn't recognize laughing too loudly near the bar. And then I heard Donna's voice in my ear. Not Donna. I didn't have my phone out. No, I was hearing a voicemail I'd listened to in the cab. Marcus Webb, my attorney, reminding me that the annual review of Solis Capital LLC's shareholder documents was due by year's end. Nothing urgent, he'd said. Just the standard rollover on the confidentiality clause. Call me Monday. I hadn't thought about it again. I'd put my phone in my clutch and walked toward the elevator. Now I stood at the edge of the rooftop, scanning the crowd for Daniel. I spotted him near the far end of the space, by the makeshift stage. Just a riser, really, 2 steps up, a microphone on a stand. He was in the navy suit I'd helped him pick out last spring. His hair was the way he did it for events, pushed back, sharp. He was laughing at something a man beside him had said, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt the particular warmth of seeing someone you love in public when they don't know you're watching. The way they're slightly different. The way you remember why you chose them. I started toward him. I was about 30 feet away when a woman I recognized from LinkedIn, Vivian Holt, CEO, Arrowfield Capital, I had looked her up once, professionally, the way you look up the person who runs the company your husband works for, stepped up onto the riser and tapped the microphone. The crowd quieted. Glasses stopped clinking. Someone near me said, "Oh, this must be the announcement." To nobody in particular, and I slowed my pace without knowing why. "Thank you all for being here," Vivian said. She was tall, composed, the kind of woman who made a room tilt toward her without appearing to try. Arrowfield had an extraordinary year, and none of it happens without the extraordinary people in this room. Applause. Someone near the bar whistled. But before we get into the year-end highlights, I want to make room for something a little more personal. She stepped back. Daniel stepped up. I stopped walking. I was behind a pillar now, not hiding, just stopped, 10 or 11 feet away, with a clear sight line to the riser and to my husband's face. Daniel picked up the microphone and cleared his throat, and I watched his expression shift into something I had never quite seen on him before. It wasn't nervousness, it was performance. The face of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and is pleased with how it will land. "I don't usually do speeches," he said, and the crowd laughed because people always laugh at that opening. "But tonight, I want to say something in front of the people who matter most to me." He turned to Vivian, who was standing 2 steps back, and his face did the thing, the soft, private thing that I thought had been reserved for me. I knew before he finished the sentence. "Vivian," he said, "you changed everything for me, and I would be the luckiest man in this building, in this city, if you'd agreed to be my wife." He produced a ring box from his jacket pocket. The crowd erupted. 200 people erupting at once sounds like a wave breaking, and I stood behind my pillar and felt the sound move through me like a current that had nowhere to go. Vivian said yes. She was laughing, and her hands were at her face, and Daniel slid the ring onto her finger, and the champagne started flowing double time, and every single person on that rooftop was looking at them. Not at me, at them. I did not cry. I want to be accurate about this, because I think people expect tears in a moment like that, and I didn't have any. What I had was a strange Arctic clarity, the kind that comes when your body decides there's no time for feeling and shifts into a mode you didn't know you had. I looked at the envelope in my hand. I looked at the word surprise on the card in gold letters, and I set my water glass down on the nearest high top, opened my clutch, and took out my phone. I called Marcus Webb at 7:39 p.m. "Ki kwat điều khoản 7.2, I said when he picked up. "I need an emergency board meeting within 48 hours. Shareholder request. Conflict of interest." There was a pause. I could hear him recalibrating, the way Marcus always did when something moved faster than expected. "Tonight?" he said. "Tonight," I said. "I'll explain everything Monday morning. For now, just file the notice." I put my phone back in my clutch. I put the Sedona envelope in my coat pocket. I turned and walked back to the elevator without looking at the riser, without looking at my husband, without looking at the ring catching light on Vivian Holt's hand. The elevator was empty. The descent was quiet. In the lobby, a couple was checking in and a bellhop was moving luggage, and the Christmas tree near the reception desk was blinking in slow, cheerful intervals. I walked out into the Chicago cold and stood on the sidewalk and breathed in air that tasted like ice and exhaust and the lake somewhere 3 blocks east. I had not dropped the envelope. I had not made a scene. I had not given Daniel the satisfaction of knowing that I had been there at all. Not yet. The cab driver didn't ask why I was quiet. People in Chicago cabs understand that the city produces a certain kind of silence that should be left alone. I sat in the back seat with my coat buttoned to my throat and my clutch in my lap and watched the city scroll past the windows. Michigan Avenue, the bridge, the dark bulk of the river under the lights. I was doing inventory, the way I do when I'm managing a situation instead of living through it, cataloging what I knew, what I didn't know, what I could prove, and what I only felt. The list was longer than I wanted it to be on the felt side, shorter than I needed on the prove side. I knew the speech. I knew the ring. I knew the crowd's applause. None of that was going to be sufficient when I walked into a room with lawyers. I needed more than a bad night. I needed a timeline. I started 8 months back. March. Daniel changed the password on his personal phone. He said the old one was too easy to guess and shrugged when I asked what the new one was. I didn't push. We'd been married for 11 years. I still had the joint account password and the Netflix password and the alarm code to our condo. I told myself it didn't mean anything. April. He started listing client dinners on our shared Google Calendar. They appeared on Tuesdays and Thursdays, sometimes back to back, always ending at or after 10 p.m. I checked the names of the clients once, idly, and couldn't find any of them in the Arrowfield directory I'd looked at the previous year. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that directories don't always list every external contact. June. We were at a dinner with friends. Priya and her husband, people we'd known for years, and Daniel's phone rang. He looked at the screen, stood up from the table, and said to the room in general, "Sorry, have to take this. Work thing." He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, he said it was a client overseas, time zone issue. Later that night, Priya texted me, "Is everything okay with you two?" He called the caller Viv when he thought we couldn't hear. I read that text 3 times. I told Priya everything was fine, and I believed myself when I said it, which I think now was a kind of willful blindness I'm not proud of. July. I walked past the home office where Daniel was on a call. The door was cracked 2 inches. I heard him say, in a voice I associate with reassurance, the careful, measured voice he used when he wanted someone to trust him, "I told you, it's just a situation on paper. We're not together. We haven't been together in over a year." I stopped walking. I stood in the hallway for 4 seconds. Then I kept walking, because I was not ready to know what I would know if I opened that door. That is the part I regret most. Not that I didn't act. I understand now why I didn't act. I regret that I stood in that hallway and made a choice to not know, and then carried the weight of not knowing for 5 more months while Daniel carried on. In the cab, going over all of this, I understood something. The 18 months he'd been telling Vivian they were already separated wasn't a recent lie. It was a construction. He'd built it piece by piece, layer by layer, and he'd been able to build it because I had been, what is the word? Accommodating. I had not asked hard questions. I had extended benefit of the doubt, the way you extend credit to someone you've known long enough that you've forgotten to check their record. I got home at 8:51 p.m. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, not to feel better, just to give my hands something to do, and sat at the kitchen table and called Daniel. He picked up on the 3rd ring. In the background, I could hear the muffled sound of the party still going. "Hey," he said, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone who has been expecting a call they don't want. "Congratulations," I said. Silence. 3 full seconds. "Mara." He said my name the way people say it when they're buying time. "I was there," I said. "I came to surprise you. I heard the speech, I heard the ring, I heard 200 people clapping." I paused. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it. Did you tell Vivian Holt that you and I have been separated for 18 months? 4 seconds of silence. I counted them. 4 seconds is a long time. Long enough for a person to decide whether to lie. Long enough to realize they can't. "I can explain," he started. "That's not a no," I said. "I'll take that as a yes." I set down my bourbon glass carefully. "Daniel, we have been legally married, continuously, for 11 years. We share a home. I did your laundry 2 weeks ago. You kissed me goodbye on Tuesday morning." My voice was level. I'd worked to keep it level. Whatever story you told her, whatever story you told yourself, you are not separated. You are a married man who got engaged to someone else in front of 200 witnesses tonight. Mara, if you would just let me. I don't want an explanation tonight, I said. I want you to think very carefully about the next thing you do. And I want you to know that I am already thinking about mine. I hung up. He called back twice. I didn't answer. At 9:15 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Notice filed. Board meeting request submitted per 7.2. Arrowfield Legal will receive the formal request by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Do you want to tell me what's happening? I typed back. Conflict of interest. VP engaged to CEO. Neither disclosed. I'll send you everything tomorrow morning. Marcus replied, Got it. Are you okay? I stared at that question for a while. It was a kind thing to ask, and I didn't know how to answer it honestly, so I wrote, I'm operational. That's enough for tonight. I went to the bedroom and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room we'd shared for 7 years. The lampshade Daniel had picked out, the quilt from my mother, the stack of novels on his nightstand that he never quite finished. 11 years of shared space. I didn't feel the weight of it the way I thought I would. What I felt was something stranger. The faint sensation of having been already in the process of grieving something before it officially died, like the loss had been accumulating quietly for months, and the rooftop had just given it a name. I went to the kitchen table and opened my laptop and composed an email to Marcus that outlined everything. The timeline, the voicemail, the conversation in the cab, the party, the speech. I attached a photo I'd taken discreetly at the gala of Daniel on the riser, the ring box open in his hand, Vivian's face beside him. I sent it at 10:44 p.m. Then I opened a different folder on my laptop, the one labeled Solus Capital, Arrowfield 2019 to present. I scrolled through the shareholder documents, the equity records, the annual distributions, the shareholder agreement with its clauses and subclauses, and the one paragraph in Section 7.2 that I had reviewed every year and hoped I would never need. The one that said, any kodong holding more than 25% equity may request a formal internal inquiry into conflicts of interest involving senior leadership, to be convened within 48 hours of written notice. I had 34%. I hadn't needed this clause in 5 years. Tonight, I needed it more than I needed sleep, more than I needed bourbon, more than I needed to cry. At 11:03 p.m., Marcus sent me a follow-up. Arrowfield Legal acknowledged receipt. Vivian Holt's office will be notified first thing in the morning. Mara, I looked at the timeline you sent. This is bigger than a personal dispute. We need to talk about the audit trail before the meeting. I wrote back, I know. I'll be there at 8. I closed the laptop. I took out the Sedona envelope from my coat pocket and held it for a moment. The gold surprise letters. The reservation I'd made for 2 people who no longer existed in the configuration I'd imagined. I set it on the counter. I didn't throw it away that night. I don't fully understand why. Maybe because some part of me needed to see it in the morning. Needed the reminder of the gap between what I'd been hoping for and what was actually true, before I walked into a room and began dismantling the life we'd built. Or maybe I just wasn't done being sad yet. That's allowed too. I went to bed at midnight. Daniel did not come home. His side of the bed was cool and undisturbed, and I lay on mine and looked at the ceiling and thought about a woman named Vivian Holt, who had said yes to a question she didn't have enough information to answer. And I felt, for the first time that night, something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was somewhere close to both. A strange, specific sadness for the two of us. For 2 women who'd been handed the same story from 2 different angles and told it was the truth. I fell asleep before 1 a.m. I had to be functional by 8. Marcus Webb was not a dramatic man. He'd been my attorney for 9 years, since before Daniel, since the LLC, since I was 28 and writing my first shareholder agreement with hands that shook slightly from the size of what I was trying to do. In 9 years, I had seen him raise his voice exactly once, when a contractor tried to walk back a signed term sheet. Every other crisis he handled with the same flat efficiency he brought to breakfast, methodically, without excess. When I walked into his office at 8:04 a.m. on Saturday morning, He looked at me the way he looked at complex documents, with attention that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't without it either. "You slept," he said. It wasn't a question. "Some," I said. "Good." He turned his computer monitor toward me. So did they. Arrowfield's legal team sent 3 emails between 6 and 7:30 a.m. They want to know the nature of the conflict of interest before agreeing to convene. They're stalling. "They can't stall," I said. "Section 7.2 doesn't require them to agree. It requires them to convene." "I told them that," Marcus said. "They know. They're doing what legal teams do when they're buying their CEO time to compose herself." He leaned back. "I also ran a preliminary check last night on the public-facing Arrowfield filings. Mara, there's something you need to see before we go into that room." He slid a folder across the desk. I opened it. Inside were printouts. SEC filing cross-references, internal vendor contracts obtained from Arrowfield's own public investor disclosures. 3 contracts, each dated within the last 18 months. Each signed off by Daniel Chen, VP of Operations. Each routing vendor payments to a logistics company called Vertex Bridge Solutions, LLC. "I know this name," I said slowly. "You should," Marcus said. "Vertex Bridge Solutions was registered in Delaware 20 months ago. One of the 2 registered agents is a man named Kevin Park." He paused. "Kevin Park is Daniel's college roommate. Daniel's name does not appear on the filing, but Park has gone on record in 2 investor calls as a silent co-founder." I set the folder down. The number landed in my chest before I finished processing it. $340,000. 3 contracts, 18 months, vendor payments routed to a company that Daniel effectively co-owned, approved by the same Daniel who held the signing authority at Arrowfield. The conflict of interest I'd walked in to report, the personal relationship between VP and CEO, had just grown a second story, a larger, uglier one with dollar signs attached. "He's been using his position to route contracts to himself," I said. "To a company he has undisclosed interest in," Marcus said carefully. "Yes." "That's not just a policy violation." "No," Marcus said. "That's corporate fraud, which is why I needed you to see this before the meeting, because the meeting just became something significantly more serious than a conflict of interest disclosure." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Daniel on the riser with the ring box. I thought about him saying, "I can explain." I wondered what exactly he thought he was going to explain, the affair or the money. And then I realized he probably hadn't even thought about the money. The money had been so quiet, so carefully routed, that he might have told himself it wasn't the same category. People do that. They put their crimes in separate mental compartments and convince themselves that each compartment is small enough not to count. "Does Vivian know?" I asked. "Unknown," Marcus said. "She signed off on the vendor policy framework, but the individual contract approvals went through Daniel. She may have had no visibility." "Or she may have chosen not to have visibility," I said. Marcus gave me the look that meant, possible, unprovable, don't lead with it. I nodded. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Arrowfield's offices on Wacker Drive. Marcus had requested that all parties, meaning himself, me, Arrowfield's general counsel, and any senior leadership named in the inquiry, be present. The room Arrowfield chose was on the 22nd floor, a glass-walled conference room that looked out over the river on one side and the building's internal atrium on the other. I'd never been inside Arrowfield's offices before. I'd paid for a significant portion of the building they occupied, but I had never walked those floors. I wore a charcoal blazer and flat-heeled boots. I carried a leather portfolio that contained the shareholder agreement, the 3 flagged vendor contracts Marcus had printed, the Solus Capital Equity Certificate, and a single index card with 5 numbers written on it. 34, 11, 18, 200, 340,000. The numbers I would need to be sure of, no matter what the room threw at me. We arrived at 1:52 p.m. The receptionist, a young man who looked like he'd been briefed that something was wrong without being told what, walked us to the conference room without making small talk. The Aerofield General Counsel, a woman named Patricia Crane, was already there, laptop open, expression professional. She shook Marcus's hand and then mine and said, in the tone of someone trying to establish scope, "Ms. Chen, I want to clarify up front that we take all shareholder inquiries seriously, and we're committed to a transparent process." "I know you are," I said pleasantly. "That's why I invoked 7.2 instead of going straight to the SEC. Patricia Crane's expression didn't change, but her pen moved a millimeter on the notepad in front of her. We sat. Marcus laid out the initial framing: conflict of interest, undisclosed personal relationship between VP of Operations and CEO, duration of relationship unknown but estimated 18+ months, potential impact on decision-making and corporate governance. Patricia Crane listened and typed and asked clarifying questions in a voice designed to sound neutral. At 2:11 p.m., the door opened. Vivian Holt walked in first. I had seen her on LinkedIn, in Aerofield's investor materials, in a photograph from a Chicago Business Journal profile that I'd read years ago when the company first appeared in a regional top 25 list. In person, she was, I want to be precise here, the kind of person who occupies a room without announcing herself. She moved like someone who had stopped needing to prove things a long time ago. She was in a gray suit, no jewelry except small gold studs, and her face was composed in the specific way of someone who has had an extraordinarily bad 18 hours and has decided that no one in this room is going to see that. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Patricia Crane. She looked at me. She didn't recognize me. Of course she didn't. She had never met me. I was a name on a document to her. Solis Capital LLC, 34% equity, shareholder since 2019. And that name was my name before Daniel, and he had never connected those dots because he hadn't known there were dots to connect. "Ms. Holt," Marcus said, "thank you for convening on short notice. You know Patricia Crane. This is Mara Solis, representing Solis Capital LLC." I watched Vivian's face do something quick and involuntary. A micro-expression, less than half a second, the look of a person encountering a piece of information that doesn't fit the puzzle they've assembled. She knew the name Solis Capital. She had signed a board document co-signed by that entity. She just hadn't had a face for it. "Miss Solis," she said, with precise, contained professionalism. "Ms. Holt," I said. Then the door opened again, and Daniel walked in. He was in the same navy suit from the night before. I wondered if he'd gone home at all. He was carrying a leather folio and walking with the posture of a man who had prepared 3 explanations and wasn't sure which one he was going to need. His eyes went to Patricia Crane first, then Marcus, then, and I watched it happen, watched the exact moment his spatial awareness caught up with his visual field, to me. He stopped walking. Not dramatically, not a full stop. A half-step pause, the kind the body produces when the brain sends a signal that something has gone wrong before the conscious mind has finished identifying what. Then he continued to the chair Patricia Crane had indicated, 3 seats down from me, and sat down and put his folio on the table and did not look at me again. Vivian was still standing. I saw her eyes move from Daniel to me and back, the same way mine had moved through a room the night before, scanning for information. I saw the moment the information reached her. Not all of it. She didn't have all of it yet, but enough. The particular stillness that crossed her face was the stillness of a woman understanding that a thing she thought was personal is also professional, and that the professional part is going to be significantly worse. She sat down. Marcus spoke. He laid out the conflict of interest. He named the relationship, the duration, the lack of disclosure, the governance implications. He was methodical and unflinching, and did not look at Daniel while he spoke. Patricia Crane typed. Vivian listened with the expression of someone who has decided to receive information before responding to any of it. Daniel said, "Twice, I'd like to address that." And Marcus said, "Twice, you'll have the opportunity. Let me complete the initial framing." Then Marcus said, "Additionally, in the course of reviewing documentation relevant to this inquiry, Solis Capital LLC identified 3 vendor contracts approved by Mr. Chen in the past 18 months, routing a combined $340,000 in payments to Vertex Bridge Solutions LLC, a company in which Mr. Chen holds undisclosed co-ownership interest. The room changed. Vivian's composure did not break, but it recalibrated. I saw it, a small, controlled recalibration, the way a captain adjusts course when new weather data comes in. Patricia Crane stopped typing for 1 full second before resuming. Daniel's hand on the table became very still. That is, Marcus continued, a conflict of interest not merely in the personal sense, but in the financial and fiduciary sense, constituting a potential violation of Aerofield's ethics policy, the shareholder agreement, and applicable securities regulations. I want a lawyer, Daniel said. You're welcome to request one, Patricia Crane said quietly. The meeting can be paused. No, Vivian said. Her voice was very even. We continue. She looked at Patricia. I want a full audit initiated by end of business Monday. I want all 3 contracts reviewed, and I want Mr. Chen's signing authority suspended effective immediately, pending investigation. Patricia Crane made a note. Vivian, Daniel said, and there was something raw and unprepared in his voice, a register I recognized from the private arguments of a long marriage, the voice he used when he had no remaining strategies. I can explain the contracts. The vendor relationship was pre-existing. Don't, Vivian said, not loudly, very quietly. The word closed a door. She looked at me then, at me directly, for the first time since the name Mara Solis had been placed in the same room as a face she could see. Miss Solis, she said, I'd like to request a brief recess. 5 minutes. I'd like to speak with you privately. Marcus looked at me. I nodded. We stepped into the small side room adjacent to the conference room. 2 chairs, a window that looked into the atrium, a dying plant on the sill that nobody had remembered to water. Vivian closed the door. She turned to me. He told me you were separated, she said. 18 months. He told me the marriage had been over for a long time and you were both just waiting for the right moment to formalize it. She paused. I should have verified that. I made a deliberate choice not to, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I looked at her. He wasn't separated, I said. We were not separated. We have never filed any separation document. We are currently married and have been continuously for 11 years. Something moved behind her eyes. When did you know? She asked. About him and me. I suspected around June, I said. I confirmed last night, at your party. I watched that land. I was there. I came to surprise him. I heard the speech. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. The dying plant on the sill had 1 browning leaf left, hanging by a fiber. I'm sorry, she said. The apology was not decorative. It had weight in it, the weight of a person who has just recalibrated her own culpability and found it higher than she'd been comfortable with. He lied to both of us, I said. The difference is that his lies to me were personal. His lies to you were also financial, and that's the one that's going to cost him more. Vivian looked at me steadily. Why did you come to the meeting? You could have handled this through your attorneys entirely. Because, I said, I am a 34% shareholder in a company that just discovered its VP of operations has been committing fraud. I have the right to be in that room, and I have the responsibility. She held my gaze for a moment, then she said, How long have you held equity in Aerofield? Since 2019, I said, before the company went public, before Daniel joined. Another recalibration, this one slower, deeper. He didn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. No, I said. He didn't know. Vivian turned toward the window. The atrium below was empty. It was a Saturday, and most of the floors were dark. She looked at it for several seconds, and I let her look, because I understood that she was processing not just the personal betrayal, but the structural one. The VP she'd trusted, the man she'd agreed to marry the night before, had been operating inside a company that was partially owned by the wife he'd told her didn't exist. All right, she said finally. Let's go back in. The audit took 9 business days. I know because I counted them. I kept a legal pad on my kitchen table with a running list of dates, calls, documents requested and received, names of people I needed to follow up with. Donna, my paralegal, the one who kept my actual practice from falling apart, came in on a Sunday to help me organize the Solis Capital files into a format the forensic accountants could work with. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She refilled the coffee and organized the binders, and at one point said, "You know you've been eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row," which was accurate and not the point. I will tell you what the audit found, and I will tell you it plainly, because I have no interest in dramatizing numbers. Numbers are already dramatic when they're real. Vertex Bridge Solutions LLC had received $340,000 in vendor payments from Arrowfield Capital over 18 months. The payments had been categorized under logistics and operational support. The contracts had been routed through Daniel's approval chain specifically, meaning no other senior leadership had directly signed off. The pricing on the contracts was above market rate, between 22% and 31% above comparable vendor agreements, which meant Arrowfield had overpaid, and the excess had flowed directly to a company Daniel Chen co-owned. The forensic accountants also found something Marcus had not anticipated: 2 internal emails in which Daniel communicated with Kevin Park, his college roommate, the co-owner of Vertex Bridge, using language that made explicit his awareness of the conflict. "Keep the invoices clean," he'd written in February, and in April, "V signed the vendor framework without looking at the specifics. We're fine." V was Vivian, who had not, in fact, known the specifics. When Marcus read me those emails over the phone on the 7th day, I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and held the phone in both hands and breathed steadily until the steadiness was real and not performed. There's a specific kind of grief that comes from discovering that someone you loved was more calculated than you understood, that the carelessness you'd witnessed was actually precision, that the gaps in a marriage were not accidents, but architecture. Daniel hadn't drifted from me. He'd been building a parallel structure while standing in ours, and every door he'd locked and every excuse he'd made and every Tuesday and Thursday client dinner had been load-bearing. On day 9, Patricia Crane called Marcus to inform him formally that Arrowfield Capital was terminating Daniel Chen's employment effective immediately, with cause, and that the matter was being referred to outside counsel, with the potential for criminal referral to the DOJ depending on the outcome of a further compliance review. I got the call at 11:14 a.m. on a Thursday. I was at my desk on Michigan Avenue, reviewing an unrelated client proposal. And when Marcus finished talking, I thanked him and said I'd call him back, and put the phone face down on my desk and looked at the wall for about 90 seconds. 11 years. VP of Operations, year-end gala, the ring box under the lights, fired with cause. That same Thursday, Marcus filed the divorce petition. We had agreed on the framing before the audit concluded. The petition cited the marriage's irretrievable breakdown, and the key argument in the asset division was that Solis Capital LLC was a premarital asset, registered in my name alone 3 years before Daniel and I met, funded by an inheritance that predated him, with no documented contribution of his time, money, or expertise to its growth. The LLC had appreciated significantly over 11 years, but under Illinois law, the appreciation of a non-marital asset remains non-marital, absent specific conditions that didn't apply here. Daniel's interest in contesting it would require him to prove commingling, and there was none. I had been meticulous. The grandmother who gave me that money had also given me a particular kind of stubbornness about keeping what was mine. Daniel did not come home the Thursday night after the termination. He came home the Friday. I was there. I had decided I would be there. Not for a confrontation. I was done with those, or rather, I was saving the energy for rooms that mattered. But because I'd lived in that condo for 7 years, and I was not going to vacate it for his convenience. He let himself in at 6:40 p.m. He was carrying a duffel bag. His suit was wrinkled in a way that meant he'd been wearing it for more than 1 day, and his face had the gray, compressed look of a person who has had 11 days to understand the full scope of what he's done and has not yet found a way to make peace with any of it. He stopped in the entryway when he saw me at the kitchen table. "I need some of my things," he said. "I know," I said. "Marcus spoke to your attorney. You know where we stand on the asset question." He set the duffel down. He didn't move further into the apartment, The Aerofield equity. He said, "You should have told me." I looked at him. I let myself look at him fully for the first time in 11 days. Really look, without the buffer of phone calls and attorneys and documents between us. He looked diminished. Not physically, not exactly, but there was something in him that had been load-bearing and was no longer there. "I had it before you," I said. "It was mine. It didn't need to be disclosed." "It would have been different." "It wouldn't have been different," I said. "That's the thing you have to understand, Daniel. The Goal Fund didn't create what happened. You made your choices. You made them over 18 months, very carefully, in very small increments, and you told yourself a story about each one that made it okay. The fact that I was a shareholder in the company you were defrauding is just the geometry of it, the thing that made it visible. It didn't cause anything you did." He was quiet. "The contracts," I said. "The vendor payments. Did you think about what would happen when it was found?" "I thought I had more time," he said. Not defensively, just factually, the way someone states the terms of a gamble that didn't pay. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in a long time, and I found I had nothing to say in return. We looked at each other across the kitchen. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that It doesn't," I agreed. "But you can say it." He said it again. I received it and set it down and did not carry it with me. He spent 40 minutes getting his things. He left with the duffel and 2 cardboard boxes. And at the door, he turned and looked at me, with the expression of a man who has something to say that he doesn't have the right to say. And I looked back at him until he let himself out. The door clicked shut. The apartment was very quiet. I sat at the kitchen table for a while, with my hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold. Outside, the December dark had arrived early, the way it does in this city, pressing in against the windows before 5 o'clock. The Christmas tree a neighbor had put in their window across the courtyard blinked on and off in slow intervals. Daniel's attorney called Marcus the following Monday to begin the negotiation on asset division. His position on the LLC was weak, and he knew it. The conversation was going to be about the joint accounts, the condo, the retirement contributions, the small accumulations of a shared life. Those negotiations would take months. I was prepared for that. I had a good attorney and adequate reserves, and a particular kind of patience that comes from having lived for a long time with a low level of uncertainty and learned to work inside it. What I was less prepared for was the phone call from Vivian. She called on a Wednesday, 3 days after Daniel moved out, at 7:23 p.m. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number until the 3rd ring, and then I recognized it because Marcus had CC'd me on a string of emails where her cell had appeared in the chain. "Ms. Solis," she said. "Vivian Holt. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No," I said, which was mostly true. "I wanted to call outside of the formal process," she said. "I know we'll have more structured conversations about the shareholder agreement and the audit's implications for board composition, but I wanted to say something that doesn't fit in that context." A pause. "Daniel told me things about you that I now understand were designed to make me not ask questions. He told me you were emotionally unavailable, that you drifted from each other years ago, that the marriage had become a formality you both maintained out of inertia." Another pause. "I'm a person who prides herself on due diligence. I apply it to every major decision I make professionally. I didn't apply it here, and I've been trying to understand why." Her voice was measured, but there was something under it, the specific weight of someone accounting for themselves honestly in real time. "I think I didn't want to know, because knowing would have required me to make a different decision than the one I wanted to make. That's not an excuse. I'm naming it because I think you deserve to hear it named." I sat with that for a moment. "I appreciate that," I said. "For what it's worth, I think he was very good at constructing stories that gave people permission to believe what they wanted to believe. He did it to me too, for a long time." "Yes," she said. "I imagine he did." Another pause. "I want you to know that Aerofield is committed to a full compliance response. The board is meeting next week to formalize the audit findings. I will be recusing myself from any vote that involves your equity position as a matter of obvious propriety." I'd expect nothing less, I said. There was a beat of silence that was not uncomfortable exactly. More like the silence between two people who have discovered they are standing in the same rubble and are taking stock of what's still standing. Are you going to hold your position in the company? She asked. It was a direct question. I respected it. I'm considering my options, I said, which was true. I haven't decided yet. I hope you do, she said. For what it's worth, and I recognize this is a complicated thing to say given the circumstances, you're the kind of shareholder a company benefits from having. I thanked her. She said goodnight. I held the phone for a moment after the call ended and thought about what it meant that the most straightforward conversation I'd had in recent weeks had been with the woman my husband had tried to replace me with. The irony was not lost on me. It was, in fact, so sharp it almost made me laugh. The divorce petition had been filed, Daniel's employment had been terminated, the audit was complete, the board meeting was a week away. The hinge had turned, and still my phone showed 17 missed calls from Daniel over the course of the week. Calls I had not answered, had not intended to answer, might never answer. The number 17 was not symbolic, it was just the number, but I noticed it. I kept track of it the way I kept track of all the numbers in this story, because numbers don't lie about what a person considers worth doing. And 17 calls is a measurement of desperation that tells you more about a man's self-awareness than any apology could. There was one thing left unresolved, one open question that the hinge had not yet swung shut on. The 34%. What I was going to do with it was the question that sat at the center of everything now. Not the divorce, not Daniel, not the gala or the ring or the speech in front of 200 people. All of that had a shape I could see. The equity question was the one that still had edges I hadn't felt all the way to. I pulled out the legal pad and looked at the 5 numbers I'd carried into that conference room. 34, 11, 18, 200, 340,000. Each one had done its work. Each one had held its shape under pressure. What those numbers added up to, what came next, I was going to have to think about more carefully than I'd thought about anything in a long time. 6 weeks after the gala, I sat in Marcus's office with a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once because I'd arrived on time instead of running, and I told him what I'd decided. I'm keeping it, I said. All 34%. Marcus nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has already done the calculations from every angle. That's going to be a conversation with the board. I know, I said. I'm ready to have it. He looked at me over his reading glasses, a habit of his, using the glasses as a framing device when he wanted to be sure someone was listening. You understand that holding the equity doesn't mean it's uncomplicated. The divorce proceedings will require full disclosure. Daniel's attorneys are going to argue that the appreciation on a non-marital asset is non-marital in Illinois when there's no commingling, I said. We've been through this. The LLC is clean. Donna cross-referenced every distribution, every reinvested return, every wire transfer for the last 11 years. Daniel's name appears nowhere. His money appears nowhere. His effort appears nowhere because he didn't know it existed. I set my coffee down. His attorneys are welcome to make the argument. It won't survive contact with the documentation. Marcus considered this. And the business relationship with Aerofield going forward? You and Vivian Holt sitting at the same table on a quarterly basis? We're both professionals, I said. And she's a better CEO than she was a partner to Daniel, which is not a difficult bar to clear. I paused. I spoke to her twice more last week. We're in agreement on the governance reforms the audit recommended. She wants tighter approval chains for all vendor contracts above $25,000, mandatory disclosure requirements for anyone in a senior leadership relationship, and an independent compliance officer. I support all of it. That's a significant pivot for both of you, Marcus said. Yes, I said. It is. What I didn't say to Marcus, what I'd been working out in the weeks since the gala, in the particular silence that settles over a life when a large structure inside it suddenly isn't there anymore, was that keeping the equity was not about Aerofield specifically. It was about the principle of the thing. It was about my grandmother. Her name was Elena Solis. She came to the United States from Oaxaca at 23, with a suitcase and a working knowledge of 4 English phrases, and a stubbornness about money that her children found exhausting and her grandchildren found instructive. She spent 40 years cleaning other people's houses and putting every spare dollar into a savings account she kept in a blue tin box under her bed, because she did not fully trust banks and preferred to sleep near her security. When she died, she left that account to me. Not to my mother, not to my aunts, not divided among the grandchildren, to me. With a note that said in Spanish, "You're the one who doesn't spend what she doesn't have to. Take care of it." I was 24. The account held $412,000. I have never fully understood how she accumulated that much on the wages she'd earned. And I think the truest answer is that she accumulated it across 50 years of absolute discipline and a refusal to let other people's expectations of what she should have set the ceiling for what she actually did. I put $400,000 of it into Aerofield. I kept the remaining $12,000 liquid as the founding capital for what would become my advisory practice. Solis Capital LLC was her money. It was her name, my name, her name. The thing that Daniel had tried to make disappear by building a second life on top of it was the one thing that had been, quietly, load-bearing under him the whole time. Keeping the equity was not revenge. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a temptation, in stories like mine, when the ending turns in the direction of the person who was wronged, to reach for the word revenge and dress it up as justice. What I kept was not revenge. What I kept was mine. That's a different thing entirely. The board meeting happened on a Thursday morning, 18 days after the gala. I had never attended a board meeting for Aerofield in person before. I had always voted by proxy, communicated through Marcus, maintained the deliberate distance that had kept Solis Capital LLC invisible and protected for 5 years. That morning, I walked through the doors of Aerofield Capital's building on Wacker Drive and rode the elevator to the 22nd floor. And sat down at the same conference table where I'd watched Daniel's face understand that the room he was in had turned against him. There were 7 people at the table, including me. Vivian was at the head. The 2 other board members, an outside director named Raj Mehta and a co-founder named Sylvia Garner, who had been with the company since the beginning, looked at me with the particular expression that people who have known a name on a document for years produce when they meet the person attached to it. Not hostility. Something between assessment and recalibration. I did not give a speech. I voted on the governance reforms, supported the compliance officer appointment, abstained from the vote on the interim VP of Operations search per Marcus's recommendation. At the end of the meeting, Sylvia Garner leaned over to me and said, quietly, "You've been patient with us for a long time." "I invested in a good company," I said. "I still think it is one." She nodded, once, with the compressed approval of someone who has been in enough rooms to know that most people who say that don't mean it. In the weeks that followed, the divorce moved at the pace that divorces move, which is to say, inconsistently, with flurries of paperwork followed by long intervals of waiting, punctuated by the occasional email from Daniel's attorney that required a response, and the occasional email from Daniel himself that did not. He wrote to me 3 times in January. Once to ask about a piece of furniture he wanted from the condo. Once to say that his attorney had advised him the fraud investigation was likely to result in a settlement rather than criminal charges, and that he wanted me to know before it became public. And once, the 3rd email, sent at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, to say that he was sorry. Not for a specific thing, for the whole of it. 4 sentences. The kind of person writes when they've been sitting alone long enough that the performance of sincerity dissolves, and something more like the thing itself appears. I read the 4th email twice. Then I archived it. I didn't delete it. I'm not sure I could have explained at the time why I kept it. I think it was something like, the archive is where you put things you're not done knowing what to do with. Not forgiveness. I wasn't there, and I don't know if I'll get there, and I've stopped telling myself a timeline for it. Just not deleted. Donna observed in late January that I was eating actual dinners again. She noted this with the same affect she used for everything. Flat, informational, faintly pleased. I told her I'd learned to cook 3 things in the past month. She said that was 3 more than I'd known before. I said that was true. I was not okay, exactly. I want to be careful not to skip over that, because the story has a shape now that can make it look like the facts resolved into clarity, and the clarity resolved into peace. And that's not entirely honest. I was not okay in January, the way I had not been okay in December. There were mornings when the alarm went off, and I lay in bed in the apartment that now had 1 fewer person in it, and thought about 11 years. Not about Daniel specifically, not about the anger or the betrayal, but about time. About what it feels like to understand that a significant portion of your life has been lived inside a story that was only partly true. That is its own specific grief, and it doesn't resolve on a schedule. What I had, instead of resolved, was functional. I had my practice, I had Donna, I had Priya, who came over twice with food and did not say I told you so, even though she had, obliquely, in June, and who sat on my kitchen floor with me one evening, drinking wine and talking about nothing important until the nothing important feeling had done its work. I had my grandmother's name on a corporation that was, by every financial measure, doing well, and I had, slowly, the beginning of something I'd set down so long ago, I'd almost forgotten I'd had it. The particular satisfaction of trusting my own judgment, of having made a decision that people close to me had found excessive, keeping the money separate, maintaining the LLC under my original name, refusing to commingle the inheritance, and having that decision be exactly the one that protected me when I needed protection. I had not done it because I anticipated this. I had done it because Elena Solis's voice in my head said, "Keep what's yours," and I'd listened. The DOJ referral from Arrowfield's compliance review was filed in late January. Marcus told me that the likely outcome was a civil settlement rather than criminal prosecution, given that Daniel had cooperated with the audit and the amounts, while significant, were below federal thresholds for mandatory prosecution. He would probably pay back the $340,000, face a debarment from holding officer positions at any SEC-regulated company for a period of years, and carry the word fraud in the footnotes of his professional biography for the rest of his career. That is not nothing. I want to be accurate about that. Some people, when they hear civil settlement after expecting prison, feel cheated. I understand that impulse. What I felt was something more like the mechanism worked. Imperfectly, slowly, with the friction that every mechanism has, but it worked. He did things that had consequences. The consequences arrived. A life can be significantly altered without a courtroom drama, and his was. In February, I took a weekend trip to Sedona. Alone. I booked it on a Tuesday afternoon on a small wave of why not, and I went. And I hiked trails I'd looked up on my phone, and ate good food at a place with a view of the red rocks, and sat outside on Saturday evening as the light changed from gold to pink to purple against the buttes. And I thought about my grandmother, sitting in a kitchen in Oaxaca at the beginning of her life, with her whole story still ahead of her, not knowing what it would add up to. Not knowing that it would end with a note to a granddaughter she thought was careful enough to be trusted. I thought about what I owed that trust. I decided I owed it forward, mostly. Not backward into grief, not sideways into anger, but forward into whatever came next. I didn't know exactly what that was. I was 42 years old and recently divorced, and the majority shareholder of a company that had just survived a governance crisis, and the next thing had not yet announced itself clearly. That was fine. I had learned in the last 2 months that clarity is not always a precondition for action. Sometimes you act with the information you have, and the clarity arrives after, like light that takes time to travel. On the flight home from Sedona, I pulled out a legal pad. I still use legal pads. Marcus finds this charming in an archaic way. And I wrote, in no particular order, the things I knew to be true as of February of this year. I won't list all of them, but one thing I wrote was this. The people who underestimate you quietly are the ones counting on you to stay quiet. I stopped being quiet, and the room I walked back into was already mine. I wrote it and looked at it for a while, and then I put the legal pad away and looked out the window at the country scrolling beneath the plane. Flat, vast, striped with roads and rivers and the geometry of farmland. And I felt, not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of someone who has put down a weight they didn't choose to carry and is now adjusting to what it feels like to move without it. That feeling is underrated. Nobody writes songs about it. It doesn't photograph well. But it is one of the more real things I have encountered, and I am learning to live inside it without needing it to be more than what it is. My name is Mara Solis. It has always been Mara Solis. Some things you don't need to reclaim because you never actually lost them. You just needed the right moment to remember they were yours.